In 1980, the economy still in a recession, Ronald Reagan would win the presidential election. Ronald Reagan was born on February 6, 1911, growing up in small, modest towns across Illinois. He attended Dixon High School, where he did very well in football, track, and discovered a love of drama. He would graduate from Eureka College with a degree in economics and sociology. There he acted in school plays and was involved in student politics. He immediately began as a radio sports announcer in a few stations across Illinois, before screen testing with Warner Brothers, landing a contract. He would appear in over 50 films. During the war, he would commission as an officer in the Army Air Force, but be restricted from combat due to poor eyesight. This landed him in the motion picture unit, making films for the war effort. After the war, in 1947, he would quickly become president of the Screen Actors Guild, where he proved himself to be very good at navigating labor disputes. He was also heavily involved with anti-communist efforts. This is a very tense dynamic, as much of Hollywood is dominated by communists at this point. Much of media depict this story of people in Hollywood being blacklisted for being communists. But communists had a substantial presence in Hollywood, and this depiction isn't true. In fact, very often they were the ones doing the blacklisting, making sure that people who seemed too traditional or too capitalistic were not able to succeed in Hollywood. They didn't have total dominance, but they were a powerful faction. And as president of the Screen Actors Guild, who was a strong anti-communist. This put Reagan in a tense and delicate spot, and he was aggressive. He would publicly support Richard Nixon in 1960 and Barry Goldwater in 1964. His frequent public exposure allowed him to transition into politics very easily. In 1966, he would become governor of California. He would pretty quickly try to become president, running for the nomination in 1968, and again in 1976. By the time the 1970s were reaching their end, he had had substantial experience with the public, and he knew very well how to speak and how to perform. Early into his presidency, Reagan would move for tax cuts. He had a new economic approach, which was effectively move the government out of the way and unleash the private sector. Over the past decade, as inflation was a serious problem, the Fed had raised rates, only to rapidly cut them when the economy seemed to worsen. There were high rates earlier on in the 70s, but with the poor economic growth, no Fed had really stuck with them. Yet now, Paul Volcker is the Fed chairman, and he has been raising rates to the highest level that the United States has ever seen. If you think seeing rates at 4-5% are rough, imagine seeing 20%. Volcker was committed, and he was going to beat down that inflation. He earned substantial ire for this, and somebody tried to kill him, but he did not back down. Rates were going up and staying up. Reagan would be re-elected in 1984, and things are starting to look up for the economy. The first mass-market laptop would be released. Computer technology is really boosting the economy. New financial products are being unleashed, and Wall Street is going on an absolute tear. In 1985, over in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev would become the leader, introducing new liberalization policies, loosening free speech, and allowing some free market elements to enter. Yet at the same time, in 1985, the United States would become a debtor nation for the first time since 1914. Volcker begins to drop rates as economic problems begin to subside. There's a palpable feel that a new economy has emerged. And that is true on some very fundamental levels. There's certainly the deregulation, lowering taxes, unleashing the free market, business boom side of things. But that's really surface level. Things have really fundamentally changed for the American economy. And the same is true over in Europe. The 1980s are a really substantial turning point. Nearly every major financier who's running a major bank, trading fund, lending company, any substantial financial firm has spent nearly all of their lives in the post-Volcker world. Volcker raised rates as high as 20% in 1979, and for as much as that squeezed the economy at the time, that has had a very long ripple effect ever since. Say you're a bond trader. You're a young guy and you enter a bond desk in the 1980s. You come in and rates are in the high teens. Well, from the time that you're a young junior employee to right now, when you're an older, senior, established man, you have seen rates go down for decade upon decade. This does some really crazy things to the economy. Imagine there's a company, once great and successful, but its product stops being successful. Well, if rates are constantly going down, then it could borrow a lot of money to keep itself afloat, and every couple years, refinance that debt at a lower rate, just keeping itself limping along. Or perhaps you're a private equity investor. You can keep levering up these bets, relying on financial engineering more than business, and just keep rolling loan after loan, making yourself an enormous profit. Same for a bank, same for an investor, and same for governments. So what happens in the mind of that young bond trader who's an old senior manager right now? Well, if he started trading bonds in the 1980s, he has only seen duration work on his behalf for decades. Decades until just a couple years ago in the 2020s. With these constantly dropping rates and loosening regulations, the 1980s saw an explosion of financialization. For most of American history, only the highly rated bonds were really traded much. Occasionally there were low-rated bonds, but these companies were generally forgotten about, often just left to fail, until the 1980s. Until figures like Michael Milken realized that there's gold in these bonds. People would start trading high-yield debt, realizing that if you could figure out that a company's real probability of default was mispriced in the bond's yield, you could get a substantial profit. This area of the market began to explode. At the same time, with credit markets expanding, investors began to come up with novel deals. KKR would become famous with its RJR Nabisco leveraged buyout. There was an explosion of an industry of firms raising capital to buy up whole companies, sometimes enormous public companies, and take them private. Corporate raiders would start emerging. Figures like Carl Icahn would buy up an enormous amount of a company's shares and attempt to use his influence to get the board and management to change how the business operates to be more in line with what he wanted. Sometimes he would buy them out outright, changing them, changing operations and strategy, often changing management, or sometimes doing mass layoffs of the whole company, then hoping to profit from the results. Sometimes figures like this, particularly Carl Icahn, would become so feared that instead of needing to do any real business or finance in order to get a profit, the company would just pay him off to make him go away. He would be paid to not invest. This in hand built an enormous legal industry built specifically around how to keep companies from getting bought out. The hostile takeover was in. The market also became more and more abstract. Contracts like options and futures had been around for a very long time, particularly in farming. Derivatives like futures could mean life or death for a farm. If you didn't know what yields were going to be like, what the weather was going to be, or perhaps how big your herds were going to be, then you could hedge out that risk by using futures, being able to lock in a trade ahead of time. But during the 1980s, this would explode to encompass the entire financial system. Commodity futures trading would expand, but it certainly wouldn't stop there. Increasingly, investors and traders would begin trading futures on equity indexes themselves. Pools of credit would be formed, upon which traders would be able to make derivative investments. The options market would rapidly expand, and increasingly, finance would become more and more detached from the actual economy underlying it. The market would become a place where you could make a bet on a bet. Imagine using leverage to buy an option giving you the right to buy futures on an index based on the implied volatility from options on an index of stocks. At a certain point, nobody has any idea what anyone's positions even are. It's completely detached, and everybody is just hoping that the counterparties work out. It's, dare I say, a fake market, with absurd levels of abstraction. Yet this proliferation of derivatives would lever markets up and up and up, all while leverage worked better and better for the investor as rates just kept going down, letting the whole thing spiral wildly as people could get rich, making wild abstract bets with cheap credit. Interest rate derivatives would become an extremely substantial part of this ecosystem. Investors were trading things like forward rate agreements, interest rate swaps, and increasingly, floating rate debt. As these debt-based derivatives expanded, people began to see the need for some sort of index to benchmark them against. And remember that Greek banker from earlier? Well, his idea seemed to be onto something. In 1984, the British Bankers Association would develop a standard rate precisely for these interest rate derivatives. It would be the British Bankers Association Interest Rate Settlement Rate. And in January 1986, with their reference rate system becoming extremely popular, they would launch LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. This rate would quickly become one of the most important numbers in the entire world economy. Each day, a group of the most powerful bankers in London would get together and discuss what they believed a proper overnight lending rate should be, the rate that banks lend to each other for very short-term overnight loans. And as more and more of the economy adopted LIBOR as the benchmark for interest rates, the LIBOR Committee found itself with enormous sway over the world's interest rates. LIBOR would grow to encompass more currencies, but at its launch, it was set for the British pound, the German Deutschmark, and the US dollar. That would mean that a group of London bankers had a say over what your mortgage rate was in rural Nebraska. And though there was a limitation to how much they could really deviate from economic reality, they could say whatever number they wanted. And this would lead to scandal in 2008. The bankers would simply get together and say that this is the lending rate. It wasn't based on anything happening in the market. It wasn't based on what banks around the world were doing the night before. It was what the committee said it was. And this would lead to a very interesting phenomenon. Say the Federal Reserve were to raise rates by 25 basis points, and perhaps another 25 a month later as inflation persists. That isn't a huge rate increase, but the international banking system, and particularly the London banks, making Eurodollar loans, lending US dollars to foreign countries who make their money in foreign currency and have to pay back in dollars, and fueling this large credit derivative market, those banks are a lot more sensitive to rate increases than the actual economy in the United States. And as they would scramble for US dollars and US securities to cover their system, though the Fed had only raised rates 50 basis points, the now squeezed London Eurodollar banks may raise LIBOR 100, 200 points, perhaps more. And since American banks used LIBOR as their benchmark, that would lead to situations where the Fed raising only 25 or 50 basis points would cause American borrowers to now see their interest rates rise by over 100, 200, 300 basis points, constantly forcing the Fed to have to go back down. LIBOR becoming the benchmark meant that the needs of the London banks would now supersede the needs of the American economy when it came to interest rates. If the Fed raised rates to a point that started to squeeze the London banks, then regardless of what is actually happening in the United States, American borrowers would see their rates explode. The banks of London had boxed in the Fed. This wave of financialization wasn't only limited to financial firms. The 1980s would see a retail investing boom. Back in the 1960s, Michael Jensen, a graduate student of Eugene Fama, notably of the Fama French model, would conduct a study on mutual funds. He found that only 26 of 115 mutual funds, which he sampled, could beat a portfolio built by picking stocks entirely at random. A school of thought began to emerge that active investing was pointless, that you were effectively doing the same as random chance. Working with that idea, during the 1960s and 70s, new investment funds would be launched, designed to simply track stock indices and not attempt active stock picking. The Qualidex Fund, tracking the Dow, would be chartered in 1967, and Wells Fargo's first index fund, tracking the S&P, in 1971. Yet these were only institutional funds, and not available to the public at large. But in 1974, Jack Bogle would have an idea that investors should passively invest, tracking indexes, where they would outperform by having lower fees. In 1974, he would found the Vanguard Group. The next year, launching the first index fund available to retail investors, receiving the name the Vanguard 500 Index the next year. From here, passive index funds would become gigantic, ultimately becoming a truly dominant form of equity investing. Retail investors would pile in, simply tracking the index with lower fees. As more and more companies released their index funds, it would push fees down further, getting to the really low fee environment that we know today. While this did get more of the public into investing, it does present some curious problems. What happens if too much of the market is passively invested in? Does the price discovery mechanism erode away? Does this funnel too much of the market into only a small subset of the market? Companies like Vanguard would become enormous. Other firms, like Fidelity, BlackRock, and State Street, would all grow to have truly enormous funds, all passively tracking indexes. And this would make them a very powerful and very subtle player in the economy. They wouldn't be seen actively trading or doing business, so from a quick glance, they wouldn't look as though they were powerful financial players. They were simply holding funds, yet as so much of investment became done through these passive funds, that made these funds the largest owners, and that concentrated voting power for the largest companies in the United States in the hands of just a few firms, giving companies like Vanguard, BlackRock, Fidelity, and State Street the sway over companies as if they had actually gone out and bought up enormous positions in every major American public company. That would make them key players, and people who one would want to influence. They could decide the directions of America's largest companies. They could decide the direction of America itself. And for the internationalists of the New Order, particularly the financiers of London and Europe, being able to hold sway there would yield immense power in America's economy and society. Yet pensions still controlled a large amount of shares, but over time their voting would become more and more consolidated, not in true ownership consolidation, but in the rise of proxy consultants. Two firms in particular, Institutional Shareholder Services and Glass Lewis and Company, would come to dominate the overwhelming majority of the proxy voting market. They played a very interesting role. Sometimes they would vote shares for clients, but very often they were simply advisors. Yet, as a small few firms were directing so much institutional money, that aligned voting all in one direction, and those running the consultants would gain extraordinary influence over American business. This is really a multi-decade process of increasing consolidation for American shareholder voting, leading us to a spot today where America's largest public companies are really all under the direction of the same few entities, and all in line with the same vision, goals, and ruling factions. In 1986, the Iran-Contra affair would begin to break. In 1979, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a group of Marxist rebels, would overthrow the US-backed government of Nicaragua, dealing a major blow to American foreign policy and American influence. In 1981, President Reagan would begin covertly backing the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua who were seeking to overthrow the Sandinista government. The United States hoped that this might bring the country back into their sphere of influence. The CIA would begin training and equipping the Contras, giving them strong support. However, the next year, Congress would pass the Boland Amendment, prohibiting the CIA and Department of Defense from spending funds to overthrow the Nicaraguan government, and limiting the ability for them to provide support to the Contras. In 1984, an even stronger version of this bill would be passed, completely prohibiting all agencies from backing the Contras and seeking to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. 1 year later, in 1985, 7 American hostages would be taken by the Shia militant group Hezbollah, a group which had strong Iranian backing. Reagan would attempt to secure the release of the hostages, but would become frustrated as he made little progress. That same year, Israel, with US support and encouragement, would begin secret arms sales to Iran, hoping to gain influence with the moderates in the country. In August 1985, the first shipment of anti-tank missiles would be delivered to Iran. That same day, the hostages would be released. Shipments would continue, and in 1986, the US would begin direct arms sales to Iran. They would set up a sophisticated financial network designed to obscure these transactions, much of it rooted through shell organizations and banks in Switzerland. The CIA, who had been banned by Congress from providing material support to the Contras, used the profits from the arms sales and covertly routed them to the Contras. Yet on October 5th, 1986, an American cargo plane with supplies for the Contras would be shot down over Nicaragua. An American crewman would be captured, and the details of the plan begin to be revealed. Reagan would deny knowledge of the operation. He would set up the Tower Commission, designed to investigate the affair. Ultimately, when the commission published its report, Reagan would address the nation on a televised broadcast, accepting responsibility, but maintaining that he did not know what was going on. Investigations would continue in the House and lead to criminal charges. During the 1970s, the intelligence apparatus had been put on a leash. They weren't trusted, and their powers curtailed. Yet the 1980s would see Reagan begin to unleash them, and unleash them in a new form. As the drug market in the United States had expanded, organized criminal networks in South America had become extraordinarily wealthy, and powerful political players in their own right, particularly the now legendary Pablo Escobar. In 1989, the Senate's Kerry Commission would release a report finding that individuals providing support to the Contras were involved in drug trafficking, that the Contra supply network was used by traffickers, that the Contras received financial and material support from traffickers, that the U.S. State Department paid over $806,000 to 4 companies owned and operated by traffickers, and that the intelligence agencies knew full well exactly what was going on. This would be investigated further in later years. In 1998, the CIA Inspector General's report, the HITS report, would find that the CIA had relationships with the implicated companies in trafficking, and that the CIA was well aware of the network and accepted drug trafficking as part of the Contra operation. Much more detail beyond that is unclear. There have been third-party researchers and conjecture. One of the largest claims that has been made is that the CIA facilitated the direct sale of cocaine by the Contras to gangs in Los Angeles, ultimately contributing to the crack epidemic, as well as raising questions as to just how much support CIA asset Panama's Manuel Noriega received. It's clear that intelligence knew, and was perfectly happy to work with drug traffickers as part of their ecosystem, but precisely the details of their support, that's the question. Beginning in the 1980s, these drug trafficking networks would become extraordinarily powerful, with enormous amounts of money running through them. Money that has to get its way into banks somehow. A very large international banking web had been formed. There was a reason that Iran-Contra payments went through Switzerland. At the time, Switzerland had a banking system that was very secretive. If you wanted transactions and accounts in a place where very little information could be discovered, Switzerland was your place. But it was not merely Switzerland. Singapore, Hong Kong, the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Bermuda. A vast banking system had been constructed where payments could move around the world, assets could be held and hidden, and it was as if they had just disappeared. So much of the global economy would begin running through this network, a network particularly dominated by the old British Empire banks and by the Swiss banks. In 2016, the Panama Papers would be released, implicating many thousands of entities going back to the 1970s, all using this offshore network to obscure their assets and hide transactions, much of it to evade taxes. Yet, as we've seen with the Iran-Contra affair, it's also a marvelous link between the criminal world and governments, and between them and the financial system. This obscured banking network is truly enormous, and has allowed very powerful entities to conduct finance in utter secrecy. Precisely how much wealth is in this system is unknown, but one thing that is clear: the government, criminal, business, and financial entities that make up this web constitute a powerful structure in the world, and operate as a major player in global affairs. During these years, Ronald Reagan was unleashing a new CIA and a new intelligence state. In 1981, Executive Order 12333 would expand the authorities of the intelligence agencies, create new goals and duties, and give them new capacities in information collection. This order would really be the beginning of their unleashing and the creation of new intelligence. In 1982, their ability to use covert operations would be expanded, and their budget would be greatly expanded in 1984. A number of other organizations would also play a role in this effort. USAID was founded in 1961 from the Foreign Assistance Act and Executive Order 10973. It was designed to give development assistance, technical advice, loans and grants, and food aid to countries. It operated under the modernization theory that if they could build up the economies and institutions of developing countries, then they would inevitably liberalize and become more like the West. That theory didn't pan out. There's an assumption in liberal philosophy, which is downstream of tabula rasa, that believes that everyone is ultimately the same, and therefore, if other countries are different and have different cultures that don't align with the liberal West, well, that's just because of what's been imposed on them. If they had the economic reality of the West, then they would be the same. Everyone is just liberals in waiting. That flopped. During the Vietnam War, they would move off of that core original aid mission and become increasingly involved with counterinsurgency efforts designed to keep South Vietnam from becoming communist. The new directives legislation of 1973 would shift their focus to the basic needs of the poorest of the world. The 1970s, seeing a strong rollback of the intelligence agencies, really put USAID in the same bucket. They became restricted back to their original mission of core economic development. Yet in the 1980s, when Reagan would unleash the agencies, USAID would establish the Bureau for Private Enterprise and begin more directly trying to shift the economies of foreign countries, attempting liberalization and austerity efforts. But it wouldn't stop there. They would become increasingly involved with covert foreign policy objectives. They would play a role in anti-communist efforts and what would be described as democracy promotion. But ultimately, they were heavily involved in proxy conflicts. And not just on the economic side. They would be involved with military and intelligence agency support. They became a key player in attempting to change the societies, institutions, and governments of other countries. They were just another tool in the Cold War proxy fights, and one that was increasingly close to intelligence and the military. Now, democracy promotion doesn't mean making there be more voting. What this actually meant in practice was using overt and covert methods to align foreign countries with the Western liberal sphere, to bring them into the zone of influence. For if a country democratically wanted to align with the Soviets, well, that wasn't real democracy. Democracy means being in the order. It was to bring all the nations of the world under the West's system and into its zone of control. Around the same time, in 1983, the National Endowment for Democracy was founded. Originally founded as a 501c3 in 1983, the National Endowment for Democracy Act would provide initial funding of $18 million, and it would be instructed to encourage democratic institutions, which doesn't mean the will of the people, it means order aligned. Its directive was to work through private sector initiatives and promote U.S. non-governmental participation. It would begin making grants in 1984, setting up the core institutions of the Center for International Private Enterprise, the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, the National Republican Institute for International Affairs, and the Free Trade Union Institute. It effectively operated as a hub for NGOs. It would disperse money and organize initiatives. It too would work closely with the State Department, military, and intelligence, and really was more putting a happy face on it. It was also backing proxies and attempting to influence the governments of other countries. But after how bad revelations of intelligence agency activity looked, they were designed to use a fusion of public and private enterprise via NGOs to do the same thing, but look better, something more palatable to the public. And as the power of NGOs would increase, and many would begin asserting direct influence in foreign countries, the National Endowment for Democracy would serve as a link between the State Department and intelligence agencies and the NGOs who were implementing their goals, acting as a centralized hub between the two, all with a much more palatable appearance. The intelligence state and NGO world that we know today really was the product of Reagan's unleashing that occurred during the 1980s. Yet at least for now, they were heavily focused on one big core concern: the Soviets. While the economy was beginning to improve, there was still a large degree of social upheaval. The United States drug market was expanding rapidly, with a strong feedback mechanism that was building up enormous drug trafficking networks, particularly the network around Pablo Escobar in Colombia. The market for cocaine would expand very quickly, and in 1981, Reagan would declare drugs to be a national security risk. The following year, the DEA budget would increase, and there would be substantial policy shifts toward law enforcement, taking a more aggressive approach against the traffickers, as well as on the street level. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 would instantiate in law a much more aggressive approach to combating the drug market. And in 1985, the Just Say No campaign would be launched, combined with new school initiatives, which did nothing. Around that time, a market for crack would become truly enormous in American cities, and the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 would further increase spending and introduce mandatory minimums. This would be expanded upon further in 1988, shifting to more aggressive combat against organized crime leaders, especially the very large-scale operation against Escobar. People began to fear crime more, and people were particularly terrified by crack. They feared a deterioration of the society, and the United States moved to a model of much more aggressive policing, granting new powers to itself, and becoming almost militant. Going back to the days of Prohibition, banks and financial institutions had come to realize that there was enormous and easy money in laundering, so long as they could remain unseen. And now, with a vastly more complex and globe-spanning financial system and increasingly sophisticated organized crime networks, intelligence, finance, and crime had formed an enormous and powerful global entity. They would fuel each other and become a powerful semi-legitimate network, yet one which needed to remain in the shadows. And at the end of all of these arrangements, it was fueled by the drug market, a drug market which financial players and some elements of the state were all too happy to see proliferate. During the same time, beginning in the 1980s, cult awareness groups began to become prominent. They spoke about the dangers of small fringe religious cults, telling stories of their dark activities. In 1980, the book Michelle Remembers would be published, detailing repressed memories of ritual abuse and cannibalism, all at the hands of a dark cult. The book would become a bestseller, and Americans would begin to fear the presence of satanic cults. In 1983, the McMartin preschool trial would begin, stemming from allegations that the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, had engaged in ritual sexual abuse, cannibalism, and sacrifice. This would really begin to grow as a concern. In 1985, the FBI would publish a training manual on cults, and over the next few years, claims of ritual abuse, repressed memories of dark cult activity, and especially sexual abuse at preschools, would proliferate rapidly. People began to look for symbolism in pop culture, and seek out therapists looking to uncover repressed memories of dark cult abuses. This wasn't the first time that Americans had become concerned with the activities of secretive groups. During the 19th century, a very large anti-Masonic movement would begin, concerned that Freemasons had dark objectives and were meeting secretly to exert their will on the country. Masons are a quite curious group, and they aren't exactly homogeneous. Their legends claim that they go back to the secrets of the Knights Templar, bringing ancient wisdom back from the Crusades. But what are they? What are they really? Their true beginnings seem to be in the court of James VI and I in the early 17th century. Prior to that, there had been prominent guilds of stonemasons, whose profile and influence would be raised in the high medieval period, when there would be a wave of cathedral building. At the same time, ancient wisdom traditions and philosophies were beginning to make their way to Europe, as texts preserved in the Middle East were being translated, particularly in Italy, where wealthy Italian patrons were paying to have the translations done. It's very difficult to tell what their initial involvement was, but the stonemasons seemed to use bits of these ancient mystical techniques to remember layouts, as a sort of enhanced psychological memory technique. In the year 1600, we have the first recorded indication of a non-operative gentleman mason being admitted to a lodge, beginning a period where the stonemason lodges were beginning to transform. Those who were not involved in the profession of masonry were beginning to join. John Boswell, the Laird of Auchinleck, would be invited to the Lodge of Edinburgh, and soon others would as well, making the lodges a club for gentlemen and not just stonemasons. These lodges would grow. The premier Grand Lodge of England would be formed in 1717, the Grand Lodge of Ireland in 1725, and the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. Around this time, Masonry began to spread to North America as well. Its members came from various social strata, said to wear gloves, so that you could not tell if you were shaking the hand of a duke or a dustman. Several contemporaneous accounts also describe them as often getting up to wild drinking, being more like a college fraternity than a professional guild. Guys getting away from their wives. But they would become heavily influenced by the new liberal Enlightenment ideals. In the United States, Benjamin Franklin would publish the Constitution of the Freemasons in 1731. He would later become the Grand Master of Pennsylvania. They were heavily associated with the American Revolution, and though there would be faction conflict at first, ultimately with Whiggery. Though they weren't technically supposed to be political organizations, these were often meetings of the most powerful men in the country. In Britain, many noblemen, Kings George IV and William IV, the Duke of Wellington, all were members of lodges. And in the United States, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Paul Revere, John Hancock, the Marquis de Lafayette, all Freemasons. Looking at the United States, with so many key players in the American Revolution, all hanging out in a club together and sharing these new liberal Enlightenment ideas, they by necessity became a hotbed for political action. Out of the lodges came much of the American Revolution. And in Britain, over the 18th and 19th centuries, Whigs would displace Tories from the Masonic lodges, and much of their political apparatus would meet there as well. Now, by all indication, much of their secrecy and much of their rituals are secrecy and ritual for their own sake, their branding, and to enforce camaraderie. And they were rituals that they themselves made up. They'd have grand revelations of secrets like, be a nice guy. At least at this point, their major role seemed to be a networking group, a place where people like the American founders would come together, and those new ideals would proliferate. In the United States, with there being an absence of a unified church, and the very watered-down, liberal Enlightenment Christianity of the day, figures like George Washington would very publicly use Masonic symbolism and ritual, hoping that that could serve as a unifier for the United States, as they were very well aware that republics and democracies have a rocky track record, and they needed some sort of unifying thing. And it worked. Masonic lodges would see a boom of attendance during the early 19th century. Yet, by the 1820s, William Morgan would threaten to expose the secrets of the Masons. Shortly thereafter, he disappeared, seemingly abducted. This provoked an enormous backlash against Masons, and membership quickly dropped. People were suspicious of what they were doing, and there's good reason. Think yourself to be a 19th century Christian, and you hear that there's a group where very wealthy and powerful people meet, and they share almost atheist ideas with each other, and this in turn influences the entire country. They engage in bizarre ritualism, and especially after you have just seen the French Revolution, and saw their direct worship of intellect itself, something which, in Christianity, is really the worst thing that you can possibly do, as worshipping his own intellect and his own will, seeking to supersede God's order, and putting his intellect ahead of God, is precisely what Satan did. You would start saying, hey, I don't really like this happening. Although it's hard to know exactly what they were saying in those meetings, they seemed to be at the bleeding edge of liberal atheism, and people in the 19th century weren't enthused by that. After the Civil War, however, attendance would pick back up, and it would grow for some time, reaching a peak from around the 1920s to the 1940s. Many of the European governments would begin opposing them. Governments like Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, or Franco's Spain, because they also weren't enthused by groups of wealthy and powerful men meeting in secret, conducting weird rituals, all with beliefs in a different quasi-atheist liberal order. That really wasn't the sort of thing that those guys liked. The Catholic Church as well would issue an edict that one would be excommunicated if they joined a Masonic lodge. Figures like Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Harry Truman, all members of lodges, with Winston Churchill in the UK as well. So while some may point to the fascist powers and say that they were paranoid about the Masons, they weren't exactly wrong. Their ideologies were incompatible, and throughout the prior centuries, they had become meeting places for extremely powerful individuals. In some countries, they were club-ruling class. But I don't mean to paint the picture that they were an all-powerful organization, and membership granted you great power. Most of the times they were local social clubs, of guys getting away from their wives. And while they formally have the rule of no drinking in the lodges, they have from time to time earned a reputation for partying outside the lodges pretty aggressively. And this would particularly manifest with associated bodies, organizations like the York and Scottish Rites, or the Shriners. They would all go off in their own directions, some community-centered, some exploring the occult, others partying and getting prostitution arrests. They each had very different characters, but as the 20th century went on, their membership would decline substantially. In the 1980s, the Lodge P2 in Italy would be implicated with extremely high-order corruption, involving the mafia, the highest figures of the Italian government, and the Vatican Bank. This would be a pretty major nail in the coffin for continental Masonry, and in the US, they were really drying up. Now, particularly from a Christian view, instances of them appearing to worship intellect would be their worst violation. People would see atheistic elements in their thought, particularly in affiliate bodies, and among the more occult-inclined groups, a sort of Gnostic Manichaeanism, ideas which many leftist philosophies can trace their intellectual origin to, at least in part, and ideas which many Christians have strong opposition to, and have for many centuries. But most of the time, they were just social clubs, a place for local guys to hang out, and often to be involved in the community, a place to feel belonging. In the large European empires, this element was particularly useful, as you could travel around the world, and always have a place to stay, and ready-made friends ready to receive you. The British in particular would invite in influential figures from their colonial lands, which in turn gave these people a sense of belonging and importance in the empire. Yet because of their rather atheist liberal tendencies, though officially believing in a higher power, and by the nature of being places where very powerful people would meet, they've always particularly drawn ire from traditionalists and the religious. There would be meetings of mystical groups, specifically so that fraternal orders across Europe and the United States could formally oppose Masonry, but much of their symbolism, their rituals and secrecy, seemed to be for its own sake. They seemed to specifically be to provoke this sort of reaction, and to build a sense of camaraderie. Oh, we're letting you in, you're going to know the secrets. They really were very influential, but the 20th century saw their high and a really sudden decline. There were much more genuinely mystical and religious groups that formed during the 19th century, particularly in Britain. 19th century Britain really was experiencing the death of God. Publications like On the Origin of Species, industrialization, and the advancement of secular liberalism had really taken away a core element of people's lives, and they felt empty. There was a crisis of faith happening. One large response to that was Romanticism, and Britain, being at the heart of a globe-spanning empire, began to become more exposed to cultures, traditions, philosophies, and religions of the world. In the early 19th century, Emanuel Swedenborg would begin writing on mystical ideas, particularly in dreams. This era would as well see the emergence of mesmerism, leading not only to the ideas of hypnosis, but it was also like a new meditation notion, with the idea of animal magnetism as a part of it. This began getting Britons thinking about altered states of consciousness, of visions, and with the crisis of faith happening, people yearned for a more authentic, direct mystical experience. Spiritualism would emerge in the 1850s, with great crazes, particularly in the abilities of mediums and psychics. People across Britain, particularly in the middle and upper classes, all the way up to Queen Victoria herself, would begin consulting mediums, trying to converse with spirits and angels. And this certainly wasn't new. Court astrologers had been a part of the British monarchy for a very long time, notably with the court of Queen Elizabeth I, with the astrologer John Dee, who claimed to have discovered the language of the angels, and also did a whole bunch of truly, utterly bizarre things. But in the 1850s, having a magician on hand was back in style. A big change would happen with the formation of the Theosophical Society. Helena Blavatsky, a Russian-born mystic, would found the Theosophical Society in New York in 1875. Theosophy is really notable because it's the first major attempt since the Renaissance to merge Christian mysticism and the traditions of the West, including many of the ancient Greek ideas, with the religions of the East, like Buddhism and Hinduism in particular. Theosophy would create a hybrid system of East and West, and many new societies would form, building off of the idea of theosophy, gaining enormous traction in Britain. Christian mysticism had been around for as long as Christianity. Many different groups would seek a more mystical approach to their Christian faith, particularly drawing on influences from the early Christians and from the mystics of the classical world. In the early modern period, stemming from Renaissance figures like Giordano Bruno, Rosicrucianism would become quite popular. Though there's no real set overarching belief system, it can be generally described as a movement of Christian mystics, believers in Christianity, who as well studied things like alchemy, the philosophy of the classical world, the mysticism of Hellenic Egypt, and over time would begin to study the religions and philosophies of around the world increasingly more. It was a movement and not a group, although many groups would form. But now in the 19th century, as the world became more international, all sorts of new groups and movements would pay attention to the East. These groups would be very popular amongst the middle and upper class. Many were seeking meaning, many were seeking direct experience, although many were also there for the aesthetic. The late 19th century would see an enormous wave of mystical societies forming, with some of the most notable being the Hermetic Brotherhood of Luxor and the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. They became interested in ancient rituals, in philosophy, meditation, and symbolism. And we really see an odd bifurcation. Many of these groups existed within a Christian moral framework, and were genuinely curious, trying to study ideas from around the world, really taking their spiritual connections seriously. Yet others began to spiral off in really bizarre directions. Some became quite political. There was an overlap of Fabian, imperial, and liberal atheist beliefs, particularly drawing from Gnostic Manichaean ideas, who studied these philosophies and attempted to apply them to political ends. Mystical technique has been a powerful part of intelligence and statecraft during the 20th century, particularly from figures like Edward Bernays, who would take ancient mental ideas and apply them to his ideas on propaganda. His 1928 book, Propaganda, really being a cornerstone of modern propaganda. But it would go far beyond this. People have been studying the human mind for millennia, and though we think that we must be more advanced with modern psychology, if anything, we've become more detached from our inner selves, and there are many ancient ideas which give powerful insight into the workings of man. Powerful and influential people and institutions would use many of these older notions, ideas from Platonist thought, from Eastern philosophies, from Hermeticism, from Kabbalah, and would apply them to influencing their populations. Thus, many of these mystically inclined groups would transform into political actors, or political actors would draw on their ideas, attempting to sculpt people's perception of reality using very old techniques, yet ones which proved to be quite powerful. Sure, you can influence people by giving them a false sense of reality for a given event, but if you can embed an entire worldview, create false paradigms, or force people into false binaries, that is a much more powerful and lasting form of propaganda. If you can embed an entire worldview, you don't even need to propagandize on a given event, as the ready-made worldview will lead people to a conclusion you want them to hold, all on their own. Many of the 20th century's great theorists on propaganda have drawn great influence from many of these very old techniques. Intelligence agencies would study these techniques as well. In the Cold War, they would begin remote viewing programs, psychic programs. The U.S. Army's Stargate project would attempt to apply psychic abilities to be used in Cold War applications. Though in the late 19th century, many of these mystic organizations were made up of members of the middle and upper class who were there for the aesthetic. Many philosophical movements did emerge, some more traditionally Christian, and some more of an esoteric form of imperial internationalism, political, imperial, and inclined to rather Fabian beliefs. Many of those groups would decline as the 20th century began, though many ideas would live on in the New Left. Out of these middle and upper class circles, new hyper-liberal beliefs would begin to form, often seeking spiritual sources to justify them. Hippies would latch onto figures like the bizarre Aleister Crowley, at least in aesthetic. Some of the Christian mystic groups, who had become overwhelmed by what they viewed as dark atheism, would undergo difficult leadership battles. Many would disband and reform new organizations. Yet the ones that had an eye more toward the political ordering of the world would move into new institutions. They would enter politics and intelligence. Many would enter academia, while others would go to form business associations. They came to realize that if their goals were political in nature, then their best bet was to be in the political apparatus. Going back to the claims and fears of abuse in the 1980s, though there was an element of moral panic, it wasn't entirely unfounded. The 1987 arrests of 2 members of the Finders, an international group founded by a retired Air Force sergeant, led to suspicion that intelligence and law enforcement were actively covering up or were involved in abuse networks. This isn't helped by the fact that intelligence agencies around the world have researched the implications of sexual abuse on children, and whether it makes them more suggestible. Much of this is shrouded in secrecy, but there have certainly been plenty of arrests of powerful business and political figures with respect to the abuse of children, a problem particularly bad in Belgium and France. There certainly have been examples of organized abuse networks, and with millions of children trafficked every year, often selling for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, someone's buying them. The market for children is very large, and plenty of groups have been found abusing children, including groups associated with prominent political figures, and with the research conducted by intelligence, research that sure raises a lot of questions, it has been found that the abuse of children can lead to easily manipulated adults. An observation which has particularly raised questions around upper-class English boarding schools. Schools famous for their stories and allegations of abuse. I can't claim to know precisely what is going on, nor who all the players are, but organized abuse certainly does exist. And particularly in light of these more sinister organizations, people have always been suspicious of groups which meet in secrecy. Many very good, well-meaning, curious, and spiritual groups exist and have done great things. Yet it is also true that there are some very sinister organizations as well. Secret societies have always fascinated people, primarily because of their secret nature. People want to know what is going on, and particularly if they're inclined toward mysticism, that leads people to wonder, do they know some great secret of the universe? Are they actually in concert with dark forces? What are they doing in there? They tantalize curiosity. And though most really are just clubs of bored wealthy people who like the aesthetic, some have played host to truly influential philosophical movements. Some have served as political gathering spots. Some as influence and patronage networks. Some were quite serious and some very unserious. The latter 20th century would see a staggering decline of influence, but influence groups wouldn't go away. Think tanks, business associations, groups of academics, NGOs, groups within the State Department and intelligence, and the rise of more and more powerful lobbyists. There's a pretty clear rule throughout the history of politics that a well-organized small group is reliably able to beat a disorganized large one. In 1987, the Dow would drop 22.6%. Shortly before, Congress had made changes to the tax policy, removing many of the tax incentives from levered buyout and mergers. Around the same time, a report of America's trade deficit would print worse than expected. Shares would begin to sell off, and over the weekend, beginning October 17, 1987, many mutual fund investors would begin redeeming their shares, far beyond the cash reserves that mutual fund companies held. Traders would begin front-running what they expected to be a decline in the market. And on Monday, October 19th, the crash over the following days would be enormous. The Fed would step in, now chaired by Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan's chairmanship really marked a turning point in the Fed's monetary policy that would persist for decades to come. There was an idea, the Greenspan put, that whenever a market downturn looked imminent, Greenspan would just step in and lower rates. It was a Fed version of Keynesianism, and at an extreme level. People would become used to the idea that the Fed would bail the market out, and this would lead to some truly wild recklessness. If you believed that whenever things would look bad in the market, the Fed would just drop rates, you'd probably be a whole lot less careful than you should be. And what does that mean for the economy? Well, it means that a whole lot of it is going to be propped up synthetically. In 1988, George H.W. Bush would be elected, continuing Republican rule, and the following year, the Berlin Wall would fall. Not only a powerful symbolic moment for the divided Germany, but in retrospect, a clear harbinger for the end of the Soviet Union. National debt would reach $2.68 billion. The 80s in the United States are remembered fondly as a boom time, perhaps a bit wild, goofy and ostentatious, certainly indulgent, but generally remembered fondly. They were a powerful turning point, and much of it behind the scenes. A new intelligence apparatus, new powers in the hands of Intel and the State Department, new financial instruments, the rise of LIBOR, the beginning of the multi-decade bull market in bonds, and the start of a constant liquidity machine. It was when the Triffin dilemma was in full force, and credit was ample. It was the start to the multi-decade run of private equity, becoming one of the largest owners of the American economy. The start to passive investing and the power of the index fund companies. And it would prove to be the final years of the Soviet Union. The drug war would begin, and the United States would enter a tough-on-crime policy era. Yet at the same time, antidepressants would hit the market, with prescriptions of Prozac beginning in 1988, the effects of which are certainly far-reaching, but very difficult to quantify. The 80s were a new boom for Wall Street, and for the City of London. It was the start of many things we expect from politics now. There's something very fun about the 1980s, but also something quite dark. But to a large extent, it was laying much of the groundwork for the world of today. Britain's 80s began with a national steelworkers strike. The Employment Act of 1980 would restrict picketing and secondary industrial action. At the same time, inflation would peak at over 20%. The British state would attempt to address many of these problems, but would have difficulty doing so. The Housing Act of 1980 would create the right to buy, allowing council house tenants the right to buy their homes at a discount. The following year, unemployment would rise sharply, reaching a level of over 2.5 million. There were inner-city riots, as ethnic tensions, particularly against the police, were becoming much more of a problem. Britain's sense of itself was in a quite odd spot at this point. That year, in 1981, Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer would marry. Lady Diana would be enormously popular with the people, and would continue to provide that feeling of continuity of monarchy. But there was a very odd celebrity aspect to her. There was tension between her and others in the royal family. She was seen as not properly upholding the institutions. She demonstrated a desire for a normal life, something which the duty of the royal family would prohibit her from. The family knew this, and had grown up with this, yet they felt that she didn't understand her responsibilities. Particularly as her marriage broke down, there would be much distress from the royal family and monarchists in how she would engage with the media. They felt she was depicting herself as a victim and undermining the royal family. In many ways, while coming from an established noble family, she was seen as emblematic of the decline of the nobility, which at this point was about as declined as you could get. Argentina would invade the Falklands in 1982, prompting Britain to go to war, leading to terrible injuries like the inability to sweat. There would be a conservative landslide in 1983, and that year the economy began showing sustained growth. Yet that economic high would be short-lived, as the following year there would be a major miners' strike, causing significant disruption. The IRA would bomb Brighton Hotel that year as well, attempting to kill the Prime Minister. During the Conservative Party conference being held there, 5 were killed. That Prime Minister would be one of the 20th century's most memorable figures, both beloved and hated. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was born on August 13th, 1925, in Lincolnshire. Her father was Alfred Roberts, a grocer and Methodist lay preacher. Her mother was Beatrice Ethel. She would attend Grantham Girls' School, and by all accounts, absolutely excelled. She would attend Oxford, studying chemistry. There she would become the president of Oxford University Conservative Association. After university, she would work at BX Plastics as a research chemist, and later at J. Lyons & Company, working on emulsifiers for ice cream. She seemed to do quite well as a chemist. Yet in 1950, she would stand as a Conservative candidate for Dartford, a heavily Labour-controlled seat. Because of how strong Labour's grip was, she would lose that election, but would demonstrate significant political prowess. A year later, in 1951, she would marry Dennis Thatcher, a quite prominent businessman. The couple would have twins 2 years later, Carol and Mark. That same year, after study, she would qualify as a barrister and begin dedicating herself fully to law and politics. In 1959, she became an MP for Finchley, and as an MP, was a staunch advocate for local government. In 1961, she would be appointed Parliamentary Secretary for the Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance. It wasn't a major role, but she had achieved it quickly. From 1970 to 1974, she would become the Secretary of State for Education and Science under the Heath government. In 1975, she would be elected leader of the Conservative Party, and from then, begin building a presence as the leader of the opposition. She advocated for free markets, reducing the power of the unions, strong defense, and a philosophical position of monetarism and supply-side economics. She was politically shrewd and a fierce anti-communist. Soviet journals would give her the name the Iron Lady. On May 3rd of 1979, she would become Prime Minister. Her platform? Labor isn't working. In March 1985, the striking miners would concede defeat, and in November, the Anglo-Irish Agreement would bring in the Republic of Ireland, giving it a consultative role in Northern Ireland, in many ways a compromise, although this didn't fully address the issues in Ulster and would greatly upset many of the Loyalists. This era was the Thatcherite era, and one of its most defining characteristics would be a large wave of privatization. In 1984, British Telecom would be privatized. In 87, British Airways, and in 86, British Gas. Those were just some of the largest national industries. In total, an enormous amount of the British economy would be privatized. And in a very controversial move, the American bank Goldman Sachs would be brought in to conduct much of the privatization. In 1986, there would be an enormous wave of deregulation in financial markets. This would earn the name the Big Bang. The London Stock Exchange and much of the financial markets would see drastically loosening regulations. Thatcher and the Conservatives would win a third consecutive victory in 1987, and the economy was doing wonderfully. That year, the economic boom would be termed the Lawson boom, named after Chancellor Nigel Lawson. There was rapid growth, increasing consumerism, and home prices were rising. Yet while this time was often thought of as a great boom, the northern industries were worsening. Similarly to what was happening to America's Rust Belt, the industrial regions of England's north were worsening during these years. This was really the end of industrial Britain. A little bit would limp on afterward, but Britain had really fully made the transition to a financial economy. Northern England was getting poorer, and its society worsening. The country was being geared toward London, while the north was let to rust. The Education Reform Act in 1988 would introduce a national curriculum and local management to the school system. That same year, on November 16th, Margaret Thatcher would give a very bold Eurosceptic speech. At that point in Britain, the political momentum was toward European integration. Yet Thatcher was a sovereigntist. She seems to have been opposed to Britain's involvement in the European project for some time. Yet with that speech in 1988, she made a very bold declaration. That caused heavy division within the cabinet and within the party. There were many factions within Britain who were fiercely on board with the integrated Europe, as well many industries, many wealthy and influential people. There was a Euro faction in Britain that had gained enormous control, but it wasn't absolute. The division was quite fierce, and now Thatcher had made a declaration of war. Interest rates would be raised significantly in 1989, and the Lawson boom would begin to end. A new poll tax would be introduced, creating a flat tax for all adults. Initially, this was introduced in Scotland. However, the following year, in 1990, it would be introduced in England and Wales. Many of the Conservative Party began to fear that this was a political liability, and for many, they began to fear their association with Thatcher. She still had great popularity, but ever since she made a strong move against the European project, some of her party and cabinet began making moves against her. Prior to 1989, many in her cabinet felt alienated and were frustrated by her stubborn, combative nature. Nigel Lawson, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer, favored European integration. He wanted to join the exchange rate mechanism, a European currency system designed to integrate the currencies of Europe. Ultimately, this would serve as a precursor to the euro. Thatcher was completely opposed to this idea. Many in the party were becoming increasingly Europeanist. Figures like Geoffrey Howe and Douglas Hurd favored Britain becoming more a part of the integrated Europe, and there was a real fight brewing about this. When the poll tax was introduced, the cabinet largely supported it, but they became concerned that it was a political liability. As the cabinet became less loyal, and the fight over European integration became more intense, Geoffrey Howe would be moved from Foreign Secretary to Leader of the House of Commons. For someone who was a longtime loyalist, it was a very aggressive demotion, and showed just how heated the conflict in the cabinet was becoming. Nigel Lawson would resign as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and very publicly proclaim his support for the European exchange rate mechanism. Now this conflict could be seen clearly by the public. This was a major damaging blow to Thatcher's authority, to see a once very prominent member of the cabinet so publicly disagree with her position. Yet it would be in the beginning of 1990, as the poll tax was being introduced in England and Wales, that the enormous backlash from the public would push many of the still loyal cabinet members to back off their support, increasing the dominance of the Europeanist faction. The party, and especially the Eurosceptics, were becoming afraid. On August 30th, 1990, Geoffrey Howard resigned from the cabinet over Thatcher's Euroscepticism and a rejection of a common European currency. And on November 14th, Michael Heseltine would announce a leadership challenge. Thatcher would win the leadership vote, but failed to secure the necessary 15% margin. Many of her most loyal cabinet members would tell her that she could not win a second leadership vote, and that it would be best for her to resign. And on November 22nd, Margaret Thatcher would resign as Prime Minister. On November 27th, a second ballot would contest Michael Heseltine and Douglas Hurd. There was strong division within the party, yet ultimately the party would arrive at a compromise candidate, and John Major would become the next Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher's rise has many similarities with Ronald Reagan in the United States. They very often worked quite closely, particularly on matters pertaining to the Soviets, and they both had an unleash the free market philosophy in their respective countries. It's the cabinet's move against her, however, that is particularly interesting. It's so remarkable that at this point, Britain had gotten to the point where European integrationists would be able to garner enough political power to force out the Prime Minister. British internal politics are extremely bizarre and extremely bureaucratic. To quote a fantastic line from the BBC's Yes Minister, administrators administering other administrators. By this point, the dense bureaucratic web of British government, between the civil service and the committees, had really become, for lack of a better term, an all-encompassing octopus. The power of ministers was really quite limited, and the civil service had asserted itself. The civil service have generally been the most loyal defenders of the new imperial order in all of Britain, and regardless of the actions of the cabinet, by this point the civil service was acting on its own, and with its own objectives. And despite losing their vast territorial empire, the British bureaucracy still held on to a sense that they were administering a vast empire. The United Kingdom is really quite extreme in this regard, and so when considering British politics from this point onward, it's perhaps more important to consider the goals of the civil servants, the bureaucracy, more than the ministers themselves. The British civil service at this point was known for being extremely technical and pragmatic, to the point of being viewed as cold, empty suits, ruthless in their bureaucracy. They generally supported European integration at this point, yet over the following decades, the British bureaucrat faction would become even more powerful, to become a truly gargantuan force, eventually earning the United Kingdom the world record for the most bureaucrats per capita, heavily in line with the imperial globalist vision. And as Britain would leave the 1980s, they would find that the European integration question was far from over. In Europe, integration rapidly progressed during the 1980s. The early 1980s saw a sizable economic contraction in Europe. The average unemployment rate would exceed 10%, and inflation would be persistently high. There was an increasing pessimism around the European economic system. But all the same, in 1981, Greece would join the European communities. Spain and Portugal would join as well in 1986. And the same year, the Single European Act would be signed. This act would serve as a major revision to the Treaty of Rome, designing a system to achieve a common market in Europe by 1992. It would also increase the power of the European Parliament substantially. West Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands had also entered into the Schengen Agreement. Its goal was to abolish border checks, hoping to slowly phase out the barriers between countries within Europe. The World Economic Forum would rapidly grow during this time as well, as European business leaders became increasingly cooperative with their goals. The World Economic Forum went back to 1971, when Klaus Schwab, an engineer and business professor, would hold the European Management Symposium. It would be attended by 450 executives from across Western Europe. It's similar to many of the other think tanks we've looked at, but a much looser association, and much more focused on business matters. Its core beliefs are stakeholder capitalism, a belief that businesses need to act in the interest of stakeholders, a wide-ranging group including employees, the communities they're in, suppliers, and really anyone you could imagine who might be affected by the company. They also had a similar technocratic view that, of course, because companies affect so many different people, the interests of stakeholders must be overseen by the enlightened technocrats, like them. It's very much in a similar vein of the other groups we've seen. Another, the world is better if we're in charge people. They believed in public-private cooperation, which is a quite fluffy term that effectively meant the same thing, that the ruling class, via the government and institutions, should have more say over what businesses do, and that public-private partnerships should be responsible for more of the economy. Their third major tenet is global governance, which is perhaps the most on-the-nose. National sovereignty should be replaced by a technocratic elite in charge of everything. It's a very common view held by the European ruling class, and the World Economic Forum really never functioned as a direct political actor, but was a meeting where these sorts of people would present their ideas, network, and mingle. It was a back-patting session for globalist technocratic leaders and would-be technocratic leaders. It attracted members by being a place that you went when you had achieved success. Oh, you got invited to Davos. You must be important. This is really emblematic of the view held by the ruling class of Europe. Rule by the technocratic elite and all under one order. To that end, the European integration project was making enormous gains, and the liberal world order would see another enormous boon as the Soviet Union would suffer substantial hits during these years. In 1980, a series of shipyard strikes would emerge in Poland. The main driving force behind this was Lech Walesa and his movement, Solidarity. Solidarity would become the first independent trade union in the Soviet Union, where all unions had been brought under the Soviet government. In 1981, the Polish government would declare martial law and move to suppress Solidarity. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev would become the leader of the Soviet Union and introduce a series of liberalization policies. Yet by the end of the decade, Soviet communism would unravel rapidly. In 1989, the Polish government and Solidarity would reach an agreement. They would hold elections, and in those elections, Solidarity won, becoming the first non-communist government in the Soviet Union. Hungary would open its border with Austria, allowing East Germans to leave the country. The Berlin Wall would fall the same year. The Czech Velvet Revolution would see an end to the communist government, and without the revolution, requiring violence. However, with much more violence, the Romanian government of Nicolae Ceausescu would be overthrown, and he would be executed. All in the same year, Bulgaria and Albania would overthrow their governments as well. The Soviet Union was crumbling. The Soviets crumbled, the bureaucratic and intelligent states rose, supranational institutions greatly expanded. A multi-decade debt bull market began. Finance got a whole lot more new toys, and London controlled the interest rates. All in all, the 80s were pretty fantastic for the financial order and the new imperial system.